ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another webinar from Signify Lighting University. The title of today's webinar is Smart Street Lighting Leadership and is being presented by Eric Woos and Barbara Kiesler. And now I would like to hand it over to Barbara.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. A warm welcome to all of you here to this webinar on smart street lighting. My name is Barbara Kreisler, and I'm the Director of Professional Lighting in the Global Public and Government Affairs Department at Signify, formerly known as Philips Lighting. As introduced, I will be your host for today's webinar. And in today's webinar, we will hear some of the exciting latest developments and trends around connected street lighting and the potential that it holds for smart cities. In that context, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Eric Woods, who is the co-author of a Navigant Research Leaderboard report that has recently been published on smart street lighting. Eric is actually leading the smart city research at Navigant, and he has written extensively about multiple benefits of connected LED street lighting. Eric will give us an overview of the current state of play with regards to connected street lighting and the key players, as well as give us a glimpse on how connected street lighting can help cities to achieve their smart ambitions. Along the way, we will also support the presentation with some practical examples of cities that have already successfully implemented connected street lighting projects in their cities. So, just briefly to point out the agenda, I will kick off that webinar with a few framing remarks to get us started, and then I will hand over to Eric for his presentations. Thereafter, we will have ample time for question and answers, and I hope you get all your questions ready, and please send them over in the question box on your screen so we can have an interactive session after the presentation. So let's get us started. The evolution of lighting has been truly nothing but remarkable. And the introduction of LED lighting has really revolutionized the way we use light today. Meanwhile, of course, LED has developed into a firmly established technology. And with instant energy savings from 50 to 70%, much longer lifetimes compared to conventional lighting, it presents really a compelling argument for cities to raise LEDs and the adoption of LEDs in their cities. In addition, LED also, of course, helps to achieve carbon footprint print reductions, and all these potential savings in terms of costs and CO2 are savings that cities can then invest elsewhere. As a next phase of smart street lighting, and as it evolves to connected street lighting, it offers unprecedented opportunities for cities to go way beyond energy savings and carbon emission reductions. With smart street lighting, cities are able to actually control their light when and where needed, improve operational efficiency, such as real time energy consumption measurements, for example, monitor outages, and make people in general feel more safe and responsive and comfortable in the cities in which they live. At Signify, we call this light beyond illumination. Then, by adding sensors to the lighting system, cities are able to collect data for greater insights and support additional value added applications. And Eric will certainly tell us a lot more about that in his presentation. So, clearly, the ubiquity of street lighting has the ability to transform cities and make them a catalyst for smart city development. And yet, despite all these different benefits, only about 11% of streetlights worldwide are LED and only 3% are connected. While it is expected, though, that this number will rapidly increase by 2030 to 35%. As smart cities become larger and more complex, the deployment of smart city solutions requires new approaches where collaboration, openness, and integrations are really key. As such, smart street lighting in cities also creates a new level playing field for suppliers, and understanding this playing field is really critical. In this context, the recent Navigant research leaderboard on smart street lighting provides great insights on where connected street lighting is heading. So, without any further ado, I will now hand over to Eric for his presentation of the evolution of smart street lighting. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. And as you said, I'm going to look at some of the emerging trends around smart street lighting, but also I think it's very important to stress that I think we're at a very important point because we're now reaching that stage where we've got a combination of proven technologies that are actually being implemented at scale. So increasingly our focus is on the execution of those projects and practical issues around funding and deployment. And yet also on the cusp of a whole new wave of innovation around street lighting as we start to understand what is possible once we have a connected network around the street lighting assets in terms of other smart city use cases and in terms of extending the way we use lighting in our streets as well as many other types of applications. So I think it's a really exciting time within the lighting industry, but also I think it's very exciting in terms of what it means in terms of the broader instrumentation of our cities and the move to a much more effective use of city resources. So I think hopefully it'll come across in the presentation that it's a very interesting stage in the development of this market. But also I think we're starting to draw out some really interesting lessons from the early adopters in terms of the success factors that are necessary to look at and some of the lessons that can be utilized by other cities. So we'll look at that as well. So to begin with, I just want to put it back in the context of the broader drivers around smart cities. There's a lot of hype, of course. There's a lot of confusion sometimes around the topic. But I think what's kept us talking about this, what's driven the momentum for cities around the world to seize on these ideas and to implement them around cities is a very fundamental set of policy drivers that you hear again and again repeated by city leaders around the world. They, of course, need to deliver efficient and effective city services. They have to ensure the well-being of their citizens. It's perhaps their core function. But increasingly, they're doing that in a context of lowering emissions, being at the forefront of environmental sustainability programs. More and more mayors around the world, as we're seeing, are committing to aggressive targets in many cases, much more aggressive than national governments in some instances, to help address a range of issues, not least of all global climate change. And of course, there is a strong emphasis on economic prosperity, and particularly how cities develop in an age of globalization in which many of their traditional industries may have moved away or are being transformed by new technologies. So these three core policy drivers, sometimes they're often in conflict, of course, are really what's at the core of what cities are looking at when they talk about moving to being a smart city. It's about addressing those issues much more effectively and utilizing new technologies to do that, but also grappling with the disruption that those technologies bring. I think we can also look at this in terms of those three core transformational elements that the cities are trying to build on to better address these issues. One, of course, is digitization, automation, the introduction of IoT, ubiquitous connectivity, big data, the whole transformation in the city in terms of the way it will use data and the way it will be able to work on a much more real-time basis across many of its core services. It's also about innovation in core infrastructure technologies, whether that's LED lighting or smart grids or new electrification of transportation. And that's driving us towards making the visions for a zero carbon city a reality. And then the third element is actually the softer element, which I think is becoming increasingly evident in terms of its importance. And that's in terms of the new types of relationship that will deliver these innovations. And that's not just about funding, but also what type of relationship a city has with its key partners, its service providers, and of course its citizens and businesses as well. And that's also in flux. And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. So we have a highly dynamic environment with great possibilities, but also considerable uncertainty as we move into new territory in the way we operate and manage our cities. In that context, street lighting is a great example of what is possible. Barbara already mentioned the basic level of savings that are possible by a move to LED lighting, and many cities are seizing on that opportunity. But equally important, they're also realizing the benefits of connectivity. And I think one of the most important shifts we've seen in the last year or two is that the idea of connecting street lighting at the same time as making an LED upgrade is now becoming the common sense almost in cities. Now, that's not to say there aren't practical issues about funding and getting policies through and so forth, but in terms of a broad recognition that this is a mainstream technology, that in fact, if you're going to be going up a pole to install LED lighting, then it makes sense to be now connecting it at the same time, rather than looking to go through the same cycle in a few years. So just on a basic level of cost, there's a strong argument around that. But also I think the benefits of connectivity are becoming clear. That extra 20% or so that can be made in terms of maintenance service and better asset use. And then also, of course, we have that vision of what else you could do with that network. But I think it's important to stress that, as with the savings in terms of energy, the business case in most cases is being built about the savings on the lighting budget that come from connectivity. And that's important because it gives that base level of confidence for cities that are looking to go down this route. So now what we're seeing is it's cities and utilities who are making the case for connecting their street lighting, that are convincing their peers that this is the right way to go, not just a message coming from the industry. What that means is we're now really, I think, at the start of another phase where we're starting to look at what do you do with those digital infrastructures? What are the possibilities for further applications to be built on that network? And what are the practicalities of deploying those new types of use case? And for me, that is very much where we are in terms of looking forward and what needs to be addressed. Now, it presents new challenges, and I think that's what cities are looking at the moment. They're looking at the business models, they're looking at the organizational structures that need to be addressed. So in many cases, it's not so much about the technology, but the softer issues that will decide how the street lighting network may be used in many more ways than it has been in the past. Now, as I say, there's still very practical issues to be sorted out, not just in terms of that wider deployment of connected LED lighting in cities, but also it takes time for lighting departments in particular to become familiar with the new technologies, to feel they're getting the best in terms of the lighting service. And so, it will be a gradual deployment of the next phase of innovation around these other applications, which I'll come to in a moment. But that's very much, for me, the cusp of where we are at the moment. So it's a very exciting time, but as I said, between driving forward on the wide scale deployment of connected street lighting and looking at these additional use cases. That maturing of the market is also reflected in terms of what is happening on the supply side. Barbara mentioned our recent report where we've actually assessed the leading players in this space. And that's really only possible when we see a level of deployment and a maturing in the product set that really makes this, I think, a realistic comparison to make, and a valuable one to make. Now, clearly, Signify has done well in our assessment. It's a leader on our grid, and I'm sure Barbara and others will talk a little bit more about the capabilities that underpin that. I want to make a broader point in terms of the fundamental message that comes from this for me in terms of the ability of Signify and other key players to actually demonstrate large-scale deployments around the world, an actual physical market presence that is expanding rapidly, and also a maturing product set that is delivering on the core capabilities required for connected street lighting, but also moving the bar in terms of the next phase, whether that's around the software platforms, integration of other applications, partner networks, or other. So it's an interesting situation because when we assess emerging technologies, we typically move from a focus on strategy to a gradual improvement in terms of execution. Where we are today in terms of smart street lighting, I believe, is that we have a strong evidence base in terms of execution for many of the leading players, and we can focus on that, and that can be demonstrated, and that's very valuable to the next wave of adopters. And we can look in terms of actual product functionality and actual number of deployments of the street lighting. But we're also seeing a new emphasis in terms of the strategy. Where will the leading vendors go in terms of their ability to support those multi-application platforms? Where will they go in terms of the integration of other solutions? Where will that take their partner ecosystem? So I think it's important to look at existing functionality, but it's also important to look at the product strategy and to look particularly in terms of the integration capabilities that suppliers are introducing. I think it's important to look at the capabilities right through the value chain in terms of delivering these lighting services, but also to look at the partner ecosystem, which is going to become increasingly important as we see lighting becoming part of that broader IoT environment. And as I say, where market presence is, of course, a very important metric in terms of actual command of or the extent that a player has a significant market share. It's also important that that vision evolves. So we're also looking for the leading players to be setting out a path and guiding and helping cities and other customers in terms of how they move forward to get the best out of the broad networks that they are now starting to deploy, and to make sure they're maximizing the new assets they're putting in, whether that's LED lighting or increasingly we're seeing smart poles as well as part of that picture. So it's still a highly dynamic space, and I'm looking forward to seeing how the players in the space evolve over the next couple of years as we move into this next phase. So round up just where we are today, I've mentioned a number of key drivers, and Barbara also talked about the broad acceptance of the value of LED, which is given the platform, an overused word, unfortunately, but given the platform which the broader deployment of connected lighting has been able to develop. We are now looking at what that platform in another sense may mean as we look at the additional applications that can be deployed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Increasingly, we'll see lighting as part of that broader data picture in cities, and that's going to be very important. I think one of the opportunities for cities, but also challenges, is them building up their data skills, understand what it means to bring deep analytics into the city operations and policy development in order to be much better at targeting resources and targeting services at the most important elements of the city, and to do that much more effectively. Because of the energy savings, there is a very good set of models for financing street lighting upgrades. It doesn't always mean it's accessible to all cities, or they're willing to take those options, but it's a much more self-evident case than it is in other application areas. But still, there's work to be done to make that easier for cities to access finance and to make sure that they're supporting the right types of deployment. But also fundamentally, I think, finally, it's about tying lighting into broader priorities and strategies that have been set by city leaders in terms of those main policy drivers I spoke before, and really situating lighting as a key instrument in allowing them to achieve their goals, not just in terms of energy savings, not just in terms of their lighting services, but in terms of many of the other areas of city operations that are starting to work, where we're seeing lighting has a role to play, whether it's in traffic management or air quality monitoring and public safety and so on. So it starts to become a very interesting set of new conversations with city leaders about the value of smart lighting. In terms of the barriers, I say cities are always cautious in terms of the way to spend money, often challenges in the way they raise capital and how they do funding. There's still more work that can be done, I think, to make that easier for them. Not so much on lighting itself, perhaps, but as lighting becomes part of a broader discussion about the adoption of IoT technologies in cities, we'll see issues around data privacy, surveillance, and also cybersecurity coming to the fore. And it's important that the industry is proactive in terms of ensuring the fundamental security of the systems. And I see that very much as something that the technology providers and companies like Signify have to be at the fore, working with their partners to ensure the technical resilience and reliability of the solutions we're offering. But also, I think there's a partnership to develop with cities around data rights and data privacy. And we've seen this becoming quite a significant issue for cities now as they try to understand what sort of models are going to be most effective for them and what type of dialogue they should be having with their citizens in terms of building the trust they need if they're going to utilize data effectively without raising concerns in terms of that being misused either by the city or by other partners. There are still some structural barriers in the market, particularly around utility ownership, which is more prevalent in some regions than others, notably United States, for example, but others as well. And I think we're already seeing a shift there. Last year or two, we've seen considerable growth in interest from utilities to deploy LEDs and to also deploy connected street lighting. And there's particular advantages for utilities, which obviously have to balance a change in energy consumption. But the balance can come from the maintenance savings they can make in terms of their operations. So as well as being driven by the push that's coming from cities to reduce their energy consumption and their energy bills and carbon emissions, there's also, I think, practical reasons for utilities to be looking at connected street lighting, and we're very much seeing that today. And then a fundamental issue which we are really, I think, need to start struggling with is the organizational challenges in terms of the way budgets are aligned, the way departments think, the challenge of thinking holistically about some of the major city challenges. We're very much now talking about smart city technologies being deployed to produce real outcomes in the city. And those outcomes really are about intractable problems that span multiple sectors, whether that's about health inequalities, lowering carbon emissions, improving public safety, addressing problems of an aging population, these big, complex, systematic problems. And in order to do that, we have to bring different parts of the organization together. And we also have to think about sharing data. That means utilizing an asset like the street lighting network more effectively. But it will mean thinking of new ways of working and thinking about how we better account for benefits and how we account for investment needed to get those multi-sector benefits. So I've spoken about the next wave, going beyond the benefits in terms of managing the lighting network and delivering energy savings. There's a whole range of things that are possible in terms of the utilization of the street lighting network. Air quality monitoring sensors, gunshot detection sensors, traffic monitoring, pedestrian monitoring, smart parking assessment, a whole range of things that the different cities around the world are currently examining. There's also better use of the pole for digital signage, EV charging, deployments of small cell connectivity to support 4G and 5G connectivity. I think we're just sort of touching on the possibilities at the moment. And really, we're at the stage now where cities are exploring these next phase use cases and trying to understand what the business model might be, and as I said on the previous slide, how to get over certain organizational barriers that may limit these possibilities. But it's very much what cities are trying to do, and I think it's going to be really exciting to see some of these early deployments, starting to scale up and starting to build repeatable business models that other cities can adopt. I've put a few examples there of cities that have already been deploying connected street lighting and are now looking at what they can do in terms of the next phase. Los Angeles, which I think is really one of the first very large scale deployments of connected street lights in an urban setting, now looking at a whole range of possibilities around that lighting network, particularly with an eye on future major events in the city and how lighting can play a greater role, but also what types of new services can be brought in. San Diego made very ambitious plans to set up a city platform off the basis of an advanced sensor network based in its street lighting network, and looking to that in terms of both improving the efficiency of the city, but also changing the way the city thinks about data and the way it interacts with diverse partners and users of its systems. In Eindhoven, a city with a very long history in terms of its connection to the lighting industry, of course, there's been a series of programs looking at innovation in lighting and how it can integrate into a range of other services, including better support for emergency services in the city. And Copenhagen, forefront of much thinking on smart and sustainable cities, has been looking at the integration of lighting capabilities with, its leadership really in terms of multi-mobility transportation, particularly encouragements around cycling, and what additional support can be provided to support those multi-mobility services through integration of lighting to make it easier to manage cycle access, to integrate the control of traffic, to make it safe for cyclists and so forth. So, just a few examples of cities testing the water, moving forward in terms of new types of capability based around their street lighting network. But it's also not just coming from a desire to better use that investment in connected lighting systems. It's also coming from a broader realization that cities need to develop a more integrated approach to data, to device management, to services. And that's really pushing a broader discussion around the nature of the city platform. It's a term that's been used for a considerable amount of time, but I think in the past it was really more of a supply side push to talk about the broader requirements of city. Now we're seeing cities themselves driving this discussion, looking to see what they need to do in terms of not only technology platforms, but also in terms of governance models, in terms of overall cybersecurity policy, in terms of data privacy, as I already mentioned. So looking at their overall strategy, which will allow them to integrate investments in things like street lighting networks, but also what they're doing on the mobility side, what they're doing in terms of looking at, say, waste management, or in terms of their public safety systems, look at how different data models can be brought together. And one of the things that is very important in terms of the evolution of this conceptual stack in the city is that it's not just about internal city services. It's very important going forward that cities are able to be much more flexible in the way they integrate with third-party service providers, other agencies, move into much more flexible co-creation of services and so forth. So there's a strong emphasis on that platform being about supporting a broad ecosystem, and also actually delivering innovations that address, as I said before, those cross-sector issues. It's not about building the siloed applications. They will still have their role in key operational areas of the city, but to address some of those big issues, as listed on the slide, around health and public safety and the environment, then we really need a new type of holistic thinking. And that, I think, is something we're just starting to really understand and actually push to the fore, both in terms of the way we're deploying technologies, but also in the way the cities are thinking about their strategies. So I think that this platform thinking, not just in terms of individual solutions, but in terms of an overall strategy for developing a broad range of IoT, big data solutions in the city, new types of infrastructure like connected street lighting, that I think really is setting an important context for cities to understand their innovation. And it's not just about technology, it's also very much about the new types of service and the new ways cities need to deliver services in an age of what many refer to as a platform economy. And that's the point really I just want to emphasize on this slide. And so we heard this concept of city as a platform or city as a service. It can sound very abstract, but clearly the impact of Uber or Airbnb on cities is very real. It may be a cliche to talk about Uberization, but clearly it's had a major impact on the way cities look at their transport services. It's also changing consumer expectations of the way city services are delivered. And also it changes the way cities think about how they will work with service providers like that in future. But also it's, I think, a wake-up call for cities in terms of the way they have to look at their own capabilities and their own platforms if they're going to deliver modern services. So this model really takes that city platform idea to the next stage and really puts it in the context of supporting multiple business models on one side. And it's important to say this does not presume that these are outsourced services or in-house services. I think whichever route a city takes, it should be considering this sort of approach as a fundamental part of its strategy. And in fact, being prepared to actually change those business models as it goes forward and be adaptable and to choose the right ones for particular situations. And I think also in the context of street lines, it's important to emphasize the possibilities for a better exploitation of city assets. And that's obviously very much what's happened with other platform offerings we've seen in the commercial world. And if we think of the street light, that very much fits into that picture. The street light now is not just a source of illumination, but it's also a platform for sensor technologies. It may be supporting a 4G and 5G network. It may be supporting Wi-Fi in the city. It may be supporting electric vehicle charging. And in each of those contexts, the street light is a different thing in some way. So it's certainly perceived in a different way. So you need the sort of systems that allow that to be easily accessed in terms of the right attributes for the right type of application. So it's all about flexibility at different levels within the city's capabilities. And I think this is very much about cities thinking of the role of multiple agencies in the delivery of services going forward. So moving from that vision of where cities, I think, are going in terms of how they deliver service in the future, and it will be a slow journey to get there. I want to go back to that point that we're really at the stage now where the emphasis is on cities executing well in terms of deployment of connected street lighting, and then looking forward to these future capabilities. So with that in mind, I want to finish not on the grand vision of what next, but on the lessons that we're gaining from those cities that are successfully deploying connected street lighting. So these points are taken from a discussion I had with the city of Cardiff, the capital of Wales, recently, and I've actually written this up in more detail on the blog, which you can access on the our website. I took some really fascinating for me insights from that discussion about the realities of deploying connected street lighting. I think the first one, and it's a grounding in the conversation, again, having been talking about broader platform capabilities. Street lighting is about lighting first, particularly for the lighting department, and the understanding of the benefits that it can deliver once you connect those street lights, but also the practicalities of delivering lighting in a particular community to particular standards and particular approaches. And I'll come back to this in a minute. The lighting professionals understand that, and that's their primary goal in life in many ways, and that can't be underplayed. And it's very important because when putting in a street lighting network into a city, if the lighting network does not deliver on what citizens expect, then it'll be much harder to sell other applications and other uses and other investments around that network. So it's important that it's delivered right and that the value is seen by citizens. And that means looking at the right lighting levels, the way lighting is managed, and so forth. It's also important that cities engage with citizens in order to bring them along on the journey. And I think Cardiff is a great example of this because the work it did on its test sites, bringing in citizens, bringing in different stakeholder groups, doing an assessment of the quality of the light, of their perceptions of the way the street was being illuminated, their feel in terms of whether this felt like a safe environment, and other factors that were going to be important in terms of understanding the specification that the city would go out with when it went to tender. So really grounding the requirement in the perceptions and needs of citizens, as well as the professional standards that were coming out of the lighting department. And it's not just about getting that specification right. I think it's also helped create a platform, to overuse the word, in terms of engagement with citizens that will help in terms of future smart city use cases. It's found a way, a language, a set of processes that will allow it to be much closer to citizens in terms of its future deployments of other smart technologies in the city. Tied to that, and this very much came across from the conversation I had in Cardiff, but also from many other engagements with local governments over the years, and including a short spell actually working on the front line myself, we can't underestimate the professional integrity and capabilities of the frontline staff, and that is going to be increasingly important as we start to scale up smart city applications, because they will be the people who are deploying these solutions. They are the people who are maximizing the benefit to be realized from them. They're the ones who really understand, where those benefits can be realized. And then when it's successful, they're the people who actually get the most benefit from it as well. And to see a lighting department, reveling literally in the new capabilities they have to be able to deliver a real-time service to their citizens, to be able to use lighting in a much more effective way, to start to engage with other departments in the way lighting can be used more effectively. I mean, that is, I think, a real joy, but it only comes about if the investment is made in the training of that staff, in supporting those staff, and if the deployment, it takes place, really cognizant of their needs and their experience. And then my final point is really about the fact that smart cities is not an endpoint. It is a journey. It's about thinking about the new ways technologies can be used to address key city challenges. I think smart street lighting is a fantastic first step for many cities. There are really strong reasons why cities can confidently go forward, gaining the benefits from a lighting upgrade, but also starting to look at what else they can do in terms of delivery of digital services in the city. That is a long process. It's a learning process, and it's one where we have to continually broaden the dialogue within the city administration and also with key partners and with citizens. But it really opens up exciting possibilities in the way this scalable and flexible digital infrastructure, which is the connected street lighting, can be used to improve city services. I think it's a really exciting time now to start to see that happen in reality, and I'm really looking forward to cities as they move into the next phase. But on that, I'll stop for a moment and hand back to Barbara for any questions people may have.
Thank you so much, Eric, for this really rich presentation. It was fascinating. And as you said, we are really in an exciting time when it comes to lighting. We have a couple of questions already in our question and answer box. I do encourage participants to send more questions in. Perhaps before I'm going to attend to the ones that we have already received, maybe just a quick question from my end, if I may, just to kick it off, Eric. I mean, you very clearly explained how smart cities are really an ecosystem, and there is no single stakeholder or single vendor that actually can do it all. The integration is absolutely key, and overcoming some of these silos, which is certainly a challenge. The question, perhaps, that I would like to allude to is, so how do cities actually best evaluate their stakeholders, and in that case their vendors? If there are several vendors that they can then choose from, how can they make sure that they work and collaborate effectively with one another, and how can they best select the vendors?
Okay. Obviously, there's no simple answer. And you know what you're building, particularly if we take that point about smart city as a journey, that we're not just talking about the delivery of a single product or a single solution, but as a partnership to ensure the best value is gained from investments made, but also to adapt and extend those capabilities going forward. So it's really a question of how do you build trust, and how do you do that between two parties, and I think that's really about balancing the risk and a clear commitment on both sides in terms of their willingness to take responsibility for the risks for which they are responsible. I think it's about a dialogue that's based on real need in the city. So I think one of the key things that cities want is suppliers that understand their particular priorities and requirements. So the biggest complaint you hear is people coming in with a product catalog to a city, and being really keen to sell a hammer, whatever the problem the city actually might have as its priority. So I think that the ability to listen is really important, and then to really show how the capabilities the supplier has address that city's needs. And I think the city needs to be assessing people in terms of their capability to do that. So, I think we're starting to see a shift away in procurement from a purely, lowest cost model. I think we're trying to do that for a while, but I think particularly this is important because we're talking about future innovation, future openness of systems. So, we're, a city inevitably, because it's public sector, has to get good value. Best value is not always the cheapest product, and in many cases you could argue it won't be. It is about a fit with the city's needs and objectives. Now, there's all the hygiene pieces as well. The solution has to have the functionality. You want to have the references. You want to have the ability of the supplier to scale the solution. You want to have confidence in their partner network that they actually have the ability to bring in the right partners as necessary, particularly in terms of that broader ecosystem. But I do think it's beyond those hygiene factors, it's about developing or finding a supplier that fits with your vision, that understands what you're trying to do, and understands it both in terms of short, medium, and long-term requirements.
Right. Thank you, Eric. I think I would like now to attend to a few of the questions that are coming in, which is great. One is that I see here on LifeI. LifeI is, of course, a very hot topic. LifeI, unlike Wi-Fi, which uses radio waves, LifeI actually uses light waves to transmit and receive data wirelessly. And the question was whether LifeI can be a new type of street lighting.
Right. I joked with you before that I didn't mind which question came up. I think you found the one that's outside my normal comfort zone. We've actually written about LifeI, and we do see a considerable application for it, particularly within the building sector. I think less as far as I'm aware within the street lighting space at the moment. There are so many more communication capabilities within the broader city infrastructure. So I don't see it as a major factor in street lighting within the foreseeable future. I do see it in the commercial building side. I'd be interested if Signify has a different view on that, but certainly that's my perspective at the moment.
Yeah, we have tested it now in a few office environments. Um, I'm not aware of any street lighting environments in which it was tested, but that's something we can certainly come back to you. Another question that actually comes in here, because you mentioned ownership, which is absolutely key, and that in the US, quite a lot of the street lighting infrastructure is actually owned by utilities. So the question that comes up here is actually whether you see ownership shifting from utilities to cities.
What we're certainly seeing is pressure on utilities that have not move forward in terms of upgrading their street lighting infrastructure. So we've seen cities taking back ownership, in some cases amicably, because the utilities decided this is no longer core to its business. In other cases, there's been a bit more of a struggle, perhaps. But certainly, cities, I think, are impatient now to see the realization of the benefits we've been talking about on the street lighting network, and in many cases they're happy for their utility to do that if they're willing to make the move. So that's, I think, one of the key drivers in seeing utilities now starting to adopt this on their street lighting much more. But there is a decision for utility, and clearly they're thinking about their future business models to decide if it still wants to be in that space. I think it becomes increasingly difficult to do nothing, given the growing number of cities with strong targets about their carbon emissions and a desire to reduce their energy costs. I think the broader question then, what happens in terms of that network as you move out into more smart city applications? That's something we're just starting to explore, I think, in those cities, and whether the utility is the best place to do that, or whether it's better to make an arrangement to allow other providers to use that network, some sort of commercial arrangement or some sort of amicable arrangement with the city. And then also, the question also goes into, what happens to the data. And I think that will be tested as we move to those broader use cases. But as I said in the presentation, we're not really there at scale enough for it, I think, that yet to become an issue. The real discussion is, are utilities willing to move forward in terms of connected LED street lighting? And if not, then I think cities will look to take control.
Sure. Another question that came in was with regards to IoT devices for the environment. I mean, you mentioned some environmental monitoring. Can you provide us with a bit more insight on that?
Yeah, so one of the most commonly stated possibilities around adding sensors onto street light network is to use them for environmental, so classically air quality monitoring. It can also be noise monitoring and other types of environmental monitoring. But the obvious and probably the most pressing one is air quality. Obviously a massive issue for many cities and a growing issue, and very high on the political agenda in many cases. Obviously, as a source of power and a source of connectivity, the connected street lighting is a great place to be thinking about placing air quality sensors. The challenge is, well, there's a few challenges. The possibilities are great, but the challenges are partly to do with the technology around air quality sensors. A lot of cities are looking at what type of air sensors they need, where they need to deploy, and what sort of number. Can you deploy many sensors cheaply to get at least a better picture of what's happening in the city, or do you really need to be looking at a higher quality of sensor that gives a more accurate reading? And then also there's the issues about maintaining those air quality sensors as well, and above all, also, what is the business model? Because of course it's not a revenue generator in the same way as in a sense energy efficiency on light is. So for air quality monitoring, cities, I think, are having to look at the cost against the political and social urgency to actually improve air quality. So it's a really interesting area. Lots of pilots and demonstrations and smaller scale projects to use the networks, both streetline networks and also through other types of citywide networks as well, to do air quality monitoring. I think it's going to be a really interesting area over the next couple of years, but there are still some challenges to be addressed.
A very interesting question that just came in was actually about the business models around street lighting and how actually they can be monetized in terms of adding additional functionalities like 5G or vehicle charging, electric vehicle charging. Could you allude to that a bit more?
Yeah. So the addition of small cells to street lights is already happening, as you're well aware, and I know Signify is involved in some of those projects. There's a very clear need, especially as we move into a 5G world, to increase the densification of those communication networks, and street lights are a obvious place to deploy small cells needed to achieve that. there is definitely a revenue opportunity around that, and cities today will charge or can charge for that access. There's a great variation on what their approach to that is. As many of you will be aware that, or may be aware, there's quite a contentious issue in the US in terms of how far cities can set the rules for that, and whether there should be broader state level or federal level regulations that makes it easier for communications companies to access the streetlights so that they don't see it as slowing down the deployment of advanced networks. On the other hand, cities clearly see it as their asset, and it's important that they get value for the city out of that asset. So yes, certainly in terms of communication networks, there is a revenue opportunity. It is being realized now. It's a fairly confused picture about how that's done and where it's done, but it's definitely happening, and it will certainly, I think, be a common element in cities as we move towards 5G networks. But at what level, I think, is still to be decided. And yes, I think probably a more patchy deployment, but potentially providing the asset to support EV charging, particularly in cities where there's not access to garages or easy parking for charging. Then that will be another option. And again, it's about the cities finding the right business model around that, whether they actually want to just encourage the adoption of electric vehicles and therefore utilize that asset to the benefit of the community, or whether they want to see it as a potential a revenue option as well. I think, again, still trying to understand what works best, and we'll see a great variation between cities, but it's certainly, I think, something that needs to be understood by cities, and to make a conscious decision about how they use the asset and whether they charge for it and monetize that value. I mean, particularly I think for these additional sort of more commercial type services like 4G networks and vehicle charging, where there is a commercial entity probably involved in terms of the delivery of the service.
Yeah, in fact, we have a great example at Signify from a project in California in Huntington Beach, where we have recently deployed smart poles where you have 5G integrated, and the city is actually charging the telecom providers, and that way financing the transition. So in that way, check out that example, Huntington Beach, California, on our website. That's an excellent example on how streetlights can actually extend their use and value. There was a question, and you have already touched upon several successful examples on whether these concepts have actually been trialed and tested, and if so, where. And you mentioned a number of them already. I would also like to mention here that we have actually deployed projects in over 37 countries and 1,200 plus projects around the world. So, as you said, the technology is there, it has been tested and trialed. Now the question is really, how can we further enhance this transition and accelerate the transition? Also because cities and countries around the world have subscribed to climate goals, and lighting can certainly play an important part in that equation. Another question was around financing models. You touched upon that briefly, but perhaps you can provide a bit more insight into that.
Yes, I mean, clearly finance is always an issue in a city context, and it's about priorities and about policies as much as it is about access to actual capital. Clearly, the energy savings that come from upgrading the street lighting network do make it easier, I think, to build a case for the finance model, and there are diverse agencies, both private and public, that are willing to support cities in terms of the deployment of street lighting upgrades, and I think that's very important. I think it really is a case of the best way to exploit the long-term savings that were made on it, and to use that to structure the right finance model. So some cities will be able to do it out of their own budgets, but I know many are going to go for some form of energy performance contracting where they get the money back. Where they pay the finance through the savings that come from the new system, and because it's more or less an assured saving, that can be done on very reasonable terms compared to some other solution areas. So it's really extending out of those models in most cases, and I think for cities it's a question of looking around at what those finances options are. Sometimes it's available from state and federal governments or national governments. Sometimes it's from funding bodies, particularly in developing countries. They're working to enable those types of finance model.
Great. Thank you for that, Eric. There was one other question about what the best wireless protocol to control street lighting would be, from your point of view.
Yeah, I'll answer that two ways. I think one of the first ones, and normally I would talk about the different technologies. I think one of the first ones is how uninterested in wireless protocols the city street lighting management team is. I think for technologists, this is the really fascinating issue, and we've written extensively around the different capabilities, and I think it is changing. But they don't see that as the biggest challenge for them. In terms of what they do with the service. The answer, as I'm sure people expect, is I say all depends. There's trade-offs in terms of coverage, in terms of cost. There's also an issue of what's your existing investment. I think it's true to say that the rising factor is cellular networks. As they become more performative, as the costs reduce on access to 4G networks and so on, that helps. We're going to see the emergence of low-powered networks in cities that I think are going to have a big impact in terms of many smart city applications. But other cities have made investments in RF mesh networks already and are going to be looking to utilize those. So I don't think this is the best protocol. I think you have to look at it in terms of your city's needs, its existing investments, what types of applications you're thinking of deploying in future, and also look at the wireless communications capability as part of the overall solution. So, how well does it fit in terms of the other aspects of the solution, in terms of, the control nodes, in terms of the platform for sensor communications, in terms of the vision the supplier has in terms of going forward for support of that protocol. And they're all going to be key in your decision. So I don't think there's just a simple answer to that. As you would imagine, I think you have to look at the different protocols in terms of your broad requirement specification.
Sure. I'm mindful of time. We have about another 2 minutes left. So I see here one additional question about competition controls that are sometimes already established in cities, and how can whether they're easily compatible and adaptable. What would be your view on that?
I'm sorry, what do you think by competitive controls?
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, I'm just reading out that. In fact, I perhaps we can just talk about controls in general. I think that probably makes more sense with regards to this question.
Yeah, I think I think perhaps if I'm putting the context of the way cities are thinking about their procurement processes and how they manage their suppliers, if that is what the question is getting at. I mean, I think cities are trying to understand how they adopt their procurement. Well, I know they're trying to understand how to adopt their procurement processes to be much better at allowing for future innovation. So again, start to think about more outcome-based procurement, to start thinking about building in the capabilities for innovation going forward, rather than a more static and price-driven RFP in the past. So I think there's a lot of thought going on. Sometimes it takes adaptation of a city's rules. Sometimes it's a state, federal, or even European Union issue. But there's a lot of thinking going around across the smart city space about more effective approaches to procurement. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I think it's also key because many of these solutions are delivered by consortiums, and we do have models for doing that now, but they can probably become, more fitting for future requirements as well.
Thanks a lot, Eric. We have come to the end of the top of the hour. This has been a really insightful presentation, and thank you very much for your time. The presentation, because that was also a question, will be available afterwards and will be shared. And if there are any additional questions, then we will certainly make sure to answer them after the webinar and get back to you. At this point, I would like to thank you, Eric, for your time and your participation. And I wish everyone a very good day and evening. Thank you so much.